1. The phenomenon of reification. 1. The essence of commodity structure has often been pointed out. Its basis is that a relation between people takes on the character of a thing and thus acquires a phantom objectivity, an autonomy that seems so strictly rational and all-embracing as to conceal every trace of its fundamental nature, the relation between people. It is beyond the scope of this essay to discuss the central importance of this problem for economics itself, nor shall we consider its implications for the economic doctrines of the vulgar Marxists, which follow from their abandonment of this starting point. Our intention here is to base ourselves on Marx's economic analyses, and to proceed from there to a discussion of the problems growing out of the fetish character of commodities, both as an objective form and also as a subjective stance corresponding to it. Only by understanding this can we obtain a clear insight into the ideological problems of capitalism and its downfall. Before tackling the problem itself, we must be quite clear in our minds that commodity fetishism is a specific problem of our age, the age of modern capitalism. Commodity exchange and the corresponding subjective and objective commodity relations existed, as we know, when society was still very primitive. What is at issue here, however, is the question: how far is commodity exchange, together with its structural consequences, able to influence the total outer and inner life of society? Thus, the extent to which such exchange is the dominant form of metabolic change in a society cannot simply be treated in quantitative terms, as would harmonize with the modern modes of thought already eroded by the reifying effects of the dominant commodity form. The distinction between a society where this form is dominant, permeating every expression of life, and a society where it only makes an episodic appearance is essentially one of quality. For depending on which is the case, all the subjective and objective phenomena in the societies concerned are objectified in quantitatively different ways. Marx lays great stress on the essentially episodic appearance of the commodity form in primitive societies. Quote, "Direct barter, the original natural form of exchange, represents rather the beginning of the transformation of use values into commodities than that of commodities into money. Exchange value has as yet no form of its own, but is still directly bound up with its use value. This is manifested in two ways. Production in its entire organization aims at the creation of use values and not of exchange values, and it is only when their supply exceeds the measure of consumption that use values cease to be use values and become means of exchange, that is, commodities. At the same time, they become commodities only within the limits of being direct use values distributed at opposite poles, so that the commodities to be exchanged by their possessors must have use values to both, each commodity to its non-possessor. As a matter of fact, the exchange of commodities originates not within the primitive communities, but where they end, on their borders at the few points where they come in contact with other communities. That is where barter begins, and from here it strikes back into the interior of the community, decomposing it." End quote. We note that the observation about the disintegrating effect of a commodity exchange directed in upon itself clearly shows the qualitative change engendered by the dominance of commodities. However, even when commodities have this impact on the internal structure of a society, this does not suffice to make them constitutive of that society. To achieve that, it would be necessary, as we have emphasized above, for the commodity structure to penetrate society in all its attempts, and to remold it in its own image. It is not merely to establish an external link with independent processes concerned with the production of exchange values. The qualitative difference between the commodity as one form among many regulating the metabolism of human society and the commodity as a universal structuring principle has effects over and above the fact that the commodity relation as an isolated phenomenon exerts a negative influence at best on the structure and organization of society. The distinction also has repercussions upon the nature and validity of the category itself. Where the commodity is universal, it manifests itself differently from the commodity as a particular, isolated, non-dominant phenomenon. The fact that the boundaries lack sharp definition must not be allowed to blur the qualitative nature of the decisive distinction. The situation where commodity exchange is not dominant has been defined by Marx as follows. Quote, "The quantitative ratio in which products are exchanged is at first quite arbitrary. They assume the form of commodities, inasmuch as they are exchangeables, that is, expressions of one and the same third. Continued exchange and more regular reproduction for exchange reduces this arbitrariness more and more. But at first, not for the producer and consumer, but for their go-between, the merchant, who compares money prices and pockets the difference. It is through his own movements that he establishes equivalence. Merchant's capital is originally merely the intervening moment between extremes, which it does not control, and between premises which it does not create." End quote. And this development of the commodity to the point where it becomes the dominant form in society did not take place until the advent of modern capitalism. Hence, it is not to be wondered at that the personal nature of economic relations was still understood clearly on occasion at the start of capitalist development, but that as the process advanced and forms became more complex and less direct, it became increasingly difficult and rare to find anyone penetrating the veil of reification. Marx sees the matter in this way, quote, "In preceding forms of society, this economic mystification arose principally with respect to money and interest-bearing capital. In the nature of things it is excluded, in the first place, where production for the use value, for immediate personal requirements, predominates, and secondly, where slavery or serfdom form the broad foundation of social production, as in antiquity and during the Middle Ages. Here, the domination of the producers by the conditions of production is concealed by the relations of domination and servitude which appear and are evident as the direct motive power of the process of production." End quote.